Brooke does not need any introduction to anybody because everybody knows who Brooke is. She's one of our special people because Brooke did her honors with us, and it was the last honors, I think, that we did at UWS. And before we were persona non grata, she won an award for her honors thesis. And she was in the last cohort to begin a PhD at UWS, and was in the first cohort to come to ACU. And it's just lovely to have watched the progress that she's made from her early days as a student to a mature researcher. And it will be great.
Totally get emotional.
And if she needs tissues, that's okay. This is a positive psychology. Without further ado.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Shall we start?
Yeah.
So hi everyone, my name's Brooke. My supervisors are Herb, Phil and Marjorie. Thank you for coming to my pre-submission seminar. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my thesis, which is on understanding the psychological and social origins of gender disparities in self-beliefs, motivation and educational attainment in the STEM fields. So I guess because I've got about trying to cram 70,000 words into a 20-something minute presentation, I'm going to give you quite a broad overview of my PhD, and then hopefully that way I'll keep it nice and short for you. I'll be talking briefly about the practical significance of my thesis topic. I'll give you a brief introduction into EVT and the research gaps in that area, and then I'll guide you through some of the highlights of studies 1, 2, 3 and 4 that make up my PhD. Okay, so before we start, I want you, if you can, to picture in your head what a typical scientist looks like. And if you're anything like me, you'll probably picture someone who kind of looks like this. And I guess from just looking at these images, the one thing that kind of strikes out to me is the fact that they're all men. And as Rhonda kind of pointed out, they all kind of look like her. So if you do picture someone that looks like her, you're not alone. These are the images from primary school children who participated in the Draw a Scientist study, which aimed to kind of tap into, I guess, young people's perceptions of science and the people who work in that discipline. And the reason why I chose to start with this slide is I think it kind of nicely encapsulates, I guess, my thesis problem that I'm addressing. So that is looking at gender disparities in STEM education. So at the moment, in Australia, only 32.3% of STEM academics are women, and this number gets to as low as about 8% in engineering. When we look at senior academics, we can see that only 13.9% of senior STEM academics are female, compared to about 30% in general academia. And in education, the problems occurring there as well. So 21.8% of girls did not take any maths courses for year 11 and 12. And only 1.5% of girls studied advanced maths alongside physics and chemistry in year 11 and 12. So I guess the question is then, why should we care about this, or why should we be interested in this? And there's, I guess, a multitude of different reasons that we could talk about, but I'll just focus on one now. So at the moment, enrolment in senior high school and university STEM courses is decreasing. And the Australian government and many other governments around the world have flagged that this has resulted in increasingly large shortages of qualified workers in the STEM field. And this could be particularly problematic because many economists have flagged, I guess, this particular field of STEM to be a rapidly growing industry that will need more workers in the next coming decades. So, as 50% of the population, women provide a huge source of untapped potential that are potentially being underutilised at the moment. But I guess before we kind of rush in and try and solve this problem, we need to kind of take a step back and actually look at why there are such large gender differences in educational attainment in STEM to begin with. And I guess historically, psychologists and educators have tried to claim that gender differences in education can be explained by innate differences in the brain that result in differences in achievement between men and women. For instance, Edward Clark, in his book that I think is quite ironically titled A Fair Chance for the Girls, said that women were unsuited to higher education because it sapped energy from the ovaries to the brain. And I thought it was interesting that he didn't analyse the effect of testicles.
Because they energize the brain.
So to some degree, this trend is still kind of occurring in, I guess, the modern day. So this article was taken from only a couple of years ago, and it cites the research of Simon Baron-Cohen, who is quite a well-renowned researcher in this area, whose male-female brain dichotomy has been used to explain gender differences in STEM and career choices. So, according to this framework, you have a male brain if you're good at analysing things, you've got attention to detail, but you have a female brain if you can sense when you're intruding. I like to think that for me is probably due to my excessive levels of neurosis and social anxiety and not my ovaries, but there we go. Despite the kind of popularity, I guess, of men are from Mars, women from Venus kind of narrative in the media, the scientific literature kind of paints a more nuanced picture. So for instance, Janet Hyde's gender similarities hypothesis has showed that 78% of published gender differences in meta-analyses have effect sizes that are small or close to zero. And importantly, this includes math and science achievement. So if levels of achievement are unlikely to explain the gender differences that we're seeing in educational attainment in STEM, what can explain it? One theory that's been proposed is Expectancy Value Theory, or EVT, and this theory has argued that young people's expectancies for success, or their self-beliefs, and also their task values are really critical in determining educational attainment goals. So, according to this theory, a young person will ask, can I do this? They'll also ask, am I interested in this? So intrinsic value. Will this help me achieve my goals, utility value, and is this important to me, attainment value? So I'll just show you, sorry, sometimes the mouse isn't working. I'll just show you a brief kind of model of EVT here, but I won't spend too much time on it. And I guess the real thing that I kind of wanted to take home from this is the fact that EVT has traditionally said that social and cultural influences are really important in terms of determining young people's self-beliefs and also their task values. However, despite the fact that EVT as a theory has really emphasised social and cultural components in terms of self-beliefs and values, they actually, as a theory, has failed to look at gender differences across different social and cultural contexts. So in other words, we know a lot about gender differences in general when we look at EVT constructs, but we know very little about how the size and magnitude of these gender differences might vary across different social categories. So for instance, is the size of the gender difference that we typically observe different in low SES or high SES groups? And I guess this critique of this research gap reflects wider critiques of mainstream psychology, which is traditionally focused on participants that are middle class and white, and also reflects critiques of feminism as a movement, which at times has ignored, I guess, the experiences of people who aren't in that middle class bracket. Okay, so the other area of research gap, sorry, the slide thing keeps on going weird. The other research gap that I talked about in my literature review was that there's a lack of research that investigates the degree to which EVT variables put together can account for the gender effect that we see in STEM educational attainment or coursework selection choices. So there's a real lack of longitudinal studies looking at those outcomes. And there's also a lack of research that uses qualitative data in the EVT framework. So I'll just briefly take you through the results of my first study. So my first study was a meta-analysis, and I looked at the gender gap for expectancy value across science, math, and verbal domains. And it was really cool because it provided an opportunity to synthesize the current literature that's out there, but also to test some moderation effects across social, class, and other social and cultural backgrounds. So therefore, kind of filling that research gap in some way. So to be included in the study, or the meta-analysis, studies needed to include both an expectancy and value component in math, science, or a verbal domain. And they also needed to have full text available and also reporting the statistical relationship between the EVT construct and gender, just so I could compute an effect size of this. So as part of this process, I reviewed 6,102 non-duplicate records with 2 other independent raters, Mike and Kat, which helped me a lot. And from this process, 176 studies were included. So studies were mostly from the last 20 years, but they range from 1966 to 2016. The age of participants ranged between 7 years and 33 years, but most participants were from that middle school kind of bracket. And studies were from every continent, but most studies were from America. Okay, so looking at the results now, our results showed that overall gender differences existed on a continuum. So starting, I guess, in the verbal domain, where we see advantages for girls in terms of their self-beliefs and values, and then going all the way into, I guess, physics, chemistry, and computing, those kind of subjects where we see larger gender gaps favouring males. So I guess you can see here on the left side of the effect sizes for the verbal domain for expectancy for success and the various task value components. And you can see that there's an advantage for female students in all of these constructs, particularly with task value. On the right side, I've got the effect sizes for biological sciences. And what was interesting about this is, I guess in general, when we talk about the gender gap in STEM, often biology sciences are lumped in with that conversation. But here we can see that girls actually had a slight advantage in terms of their interest levels towards biology, and no significant differences for expectancy for success or utility value. In contrast, the results for math and the general science domain showed an advantage towards males, particularly in expectancy for success and also intrinsic value, and this pattern was replicated in both maths and the science domain. And finally, we see the results for computing and physical sciences. And in this, we see a trend for the gender differences favouring boys becoming larger. And again, particularly we see this in expectancies for success and also intrinsic value. So I guess because there was a great deal of heterogeneity across the different effect sizes, one of the things that we did to kind of further explore this was to look at moderation effects. So one of the questions we asked was, does social class impact the size of the gender gap? And results showed that yes, there was actually some evidence that there were substantial differences across social class for expectancy value constructs. And I'll just show you kind of what that looks like visually. So we can see on the left side, amongst low SES students, gender gaps were almost zero or quite small. But as we progressively go up the socioeconomic ladder, they become quite large amongst the high SES studies that we included. Another question we kind of looked at was, what is the effect of gender inequality as measured by the UN Gender Inequality Index? So we looked at studies and their country. My brain just died while I was talking about it. I'm going to go to the next slide. You get it. So here's the gender equality moderation effect. So the results show that gender differences favouring boys actually became larger in high gender equality countries, which is quite counterintuitive, it's quite interesting. And we can see as countries become lower in national levels of gender equality, the effect size actually diminishes. And in the end, girls in the countries with the lowest levels of gender equality actually have higher self-beliefs and task value compared to their male counterparts. Another moderation effect that's probably worth looking at is we also looked at the effect of gender segregation amongst graduates. So we used a metric from the World Bank that looked at the gender ratios in STEM and humanities graduates from university. And results showed that effects became more gender stereotypical as national level gender segregation amongst graduates increases. So in other words, there was some evidence to say that young people's or the participants' self-beliefs and values reflected national patterns in terms of gender segregation amongst graduates. So I'll just quickly run through some other effects that I don't really have too much time to talk about, but I'll just briefly mention them. There were more similarities than differences in studies with ethnic homogeneity versus diversity in the samples. There was surprisingly little effect of publication date. However, this is kind of tempered by the fact that we didn't have many studies from earlier on to kind of compare. Overall, there was little evidence of significant change across age groups or participant age, and there was some evidence that sample type was associated with larger gender differences. So students in elective and advanced courses for STEM were more likely to show larger gender differences favouring boys. So I'll quickly take you now through studies 2 and 4 of my PhD. These were all based on the same database, which is the longitudinal study of Australian youth. And importantly, this database is an extension of PISA. So all the measures that I'm talking about here are taken from the PISA database, which typically they have reasonably good psychometric qualities and things like that. So because this was a longitudinal study, there are multiple waves of data collection. So I'll just quickly take you through that now. So at wave 1, participants were aged 15, and at this wave, this is when the achievement and attitude data was collected. And we had about 10,000 participants in the wave 1. So wave 2 looked at senior high school enrolment data. So obviously that was taken from senior high school. And then importantly, wave 3 was a subsection of participants who were already enrolled in senior high school STEM courses, and the study wanted to see whether they continued their STEM studies into university. And then finally, for study 4, we looked at some qualitative responses, and these were a subsection of students who either responded that they had chosen to study STEM at university or that they had not studied STEM at university. So study 2 was all about replication and extension. So one of the questions we wanted to know in regards to replication was, does the SES effect that we saw in the meta-analysis replicate in the LSA database? And we also wanted to look at extension of gender interactions to other social categories that have yet to be studied in the literature in terms of gender differences. So these included geography, so whether you live in an urban setting or a remote setting, Indigenous status, and also immigrant status. So results actually showed some evidence for a replication effect of social class by gender for math self-efficacy. However, it was reasonably small. So we can see here that the gap between low SES students was smaller and it became larger amongst high SES students. And importantly, this effect remained even after controlling for individual level of achievement. So because this SES effect was in the meta-analysis and it replicated in the LSA database, I think it's probably worth at least speculating some possible explanations for why that effect occurred. And as I've been kind of thinking about my discussion, 3 possible alternatives or perspectives have kind of fit, I guess, what the data says. So the first being a competitive environment argument. So multiple studies have shown that girls tend to self-evaluate more harshly in high-achieving and highly competitive environments. And this kind of fits in with some of the effects that we've been seeing with not only social class, with, I guess, high SES environments are more likely to be on average higher achieving and more highly competitive, but also the effects that we've been seeing with highly developed countries or countries with high levels of gender equality, and also the effects that we see with elective STEM courses. The other argument that's come up is increased gender socialisation amongst high SES families. So there's some literature out there that is showing that high SES families are more likely to involve their children in gender stereotypical extracurricular activities. And in this literature, people have discussed that perhaps this might involve a mechanism whereby children in high SES families, because they've been exposed to more gender stereotype activities over and over again, this then affects their self-beliefs, their interest, and also their abilities, because they can be channeled, I guess, into that more direct interest kind of thing. And then the last potential perspective that's worth saying that kind of matches the data would be an evolutionary perspective. So an evolutionary psychologist might argue that the results fit a pattern of sexual dimorphism. So when we look at animals, we see that sex traits become more exaggerated in resource-rich environments compared to sparse environments. So that's, I guess, another perspective that is worth mentioning. So just going on to some of the other gender interaction effects that we found in study 2. There was also an effect by gender and Indigenous status, and this showed that there was evidence of gender effects reversing amongst Indigenous students. So we can see for non-Indigenous students, for instance, with math utility value, that boys had the advantage over girls, but when we compare Indigenous students, this gender effect actually reverses, and boys have lower levels of math utility value compared to their female peers. And we also see that effect occur in measures of achievement in the study too. And importantly, I should add that remained even after controlling for achievement. The other effect that we had was that gender gaps become larger in remote areas for math anxiety and math utility value. So we can see here that amongst students who are from urban and regional centres, that the gender gap remains fairly stable. But as we go into remote communities, boys have much larger advantage compared to girls in terms of math utility value and also math anxiety. Again, these effects occurred even when we controlled for achievement. So it's also worth mentioning that in this study, I was also looking at longitudinal effects, so predicting senior high school STEM enrolment and also university STEM enrolment. Overall, there were not many significant interaction effects here, but one of them that's worth mentioning is the fact that there was a gender by regional remote interaction. So longitudinal analyses on STEM attainment in high school showed an opposite effect to what we saw with math anxiety and math utility value. And here gender differences in high school enrolment favoured regional and remote girls, which I thought was quite interesting. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there. I'll just take you briefly through a few discussion points from that study. So the first thing that's probably worth mentioning is that out of any group, Indigenous boys face the most low levels of STEM outcomes. And I think it's worth mentioning in terms of, I guess, trying to encourage more resources in that area to help them, Indigenous boys, reach their full potential. We also have the issue of urban versus remote students. So as I've been thinking about why there might be such a large gap in math anxiety and math utility value, been thinking about whether gender roles are just more rigid in rural and remote areas. But then again, I guess there's the issue of like, how do we explain this contrasting senior high school effect? With immigrant status, there was no significant interactions with immigrant status and gender for achievement or attitudes. There was only a small effect for high school enrolment, but because of time, I'm not going to go into that at the moment, but you can ask me about it later if you want. And finally, the main point that I thought was interesting was that being female consistently predicted negative attitudes, even when controlling for achievement. And this was quite unique in terms of the effect that it had even after controlling for achievement. So for instance, when we looked at social class, being from a low SES background, had negative effects on math attitudes. But once we control for achievement, these diminished. However, amongst female students, these effects still remain quite large. All right, so I'll take you quickly through study 3 now of my PhD, which looked at predicting STEM attainment in relation to EBT and gender. And so the main question I guess I was looking at here was, to what extent can EBT-related variables account for gender differences in STEM educational attainment? So just briefly, here are the effect sizes for gender differences in each of the variables used in the study. We can see that the largest effects were for reading achievement, which favoured girls. And on the flip side of the coin, boys were more likely to have higher math self-concept and higher math self-efficacy, and also more likely to report lower levels of math anxiety compared to girls. So the first stage of, I guess, the analysis of this looked at what factors predict senior high school STEM enrolment. And probably by no surprise, the biggest predictors were amongst achievement and also the EBT variables in terms of the univariate predictors. However, I think probably the most interesting finding here was the fact that gender was actually the only non-significant predictor of senior high school STEM enrolment, which was counter to our hypotheses and also counter to some of the things that are seen in the literature. And even more interesting is the fact that as you control for achievement and also attitudes, the effect of gender gets positive, meaning that being female is actually a positive predictor of enrolling in senior high school STEM when you compare students of equal ability and equal attitudes. So the next, I guess, stage of the analysis, we were looking at the same predictors but predicting university STEM enrolment. And in contrast to the findings that we found in the previous analyses, we saw that gender had quite a large significant effect on predicting university STEM enrolment. So in other words, being female was a negative predictor of enrolling in STEM at a university level. And importantly, as we controlled for achievement and also attitudes, this effect really didn't diminish that much in size, which is surprising. So I guess the question we asked ourselves then was, how much variance does current theory explain for gender differences in STEM university enrolment? So in this population, Australian males had a 15% greater probability of enrolling in a STEM degree compared to females. However, once we accounted for achievement and also the EBT variables, this was reduced to a third to 10%. So I guess the results show that EBT explains a reasonable proportion of that variance, but there's still quite a large amount of variance amongst this population that remains unexplained by this particular study. That totally scared me. Okay, so the final study of my PhD was looking at interview data of the LSA participants in that subsection that I was talking about before. So I really wanted to use this as an opportunity to explore alternative mechanisms that might explain that gender gap that are outside of achievement and also EBT variables. And I also, we were also looking at to what extent EBT constructs emerge organically in young people's responses. Okay, so this is the responses from the first subsample that I talked about. So these were kids who had decided to continue in their STEM studies from high school and enroll in a university STEM course. So overall, we can see that the motivation for studying or choosing to study STEM was by far commonly reported as intrinsic value or interest in science and mathematics. And overall, I guess the picture was one of gender similarities with a few exceptions. So these were that male students were more likely to report that they were interested or motivated by financial gain. And in contrast, female students were more likely to report that they were motivated by concern for society and environment, or that they felt that they had a lack of other options available to them. The second, is it loading? Sorry, my computer keeps on stopping while I'm doing this. 1 second. Okay, so the second sample that we looked at were students who had enrolled in senior high school STEM, but then decided not to proceed or continue with their studies at a university level. So these students were asked why they chose to disengage from STEM studies. And again, we see that lack of interest or interest is really important here. So that was the most commonly cited reason. But in addition to this, many students were reporting that they were just simply attracted to other career areas, and that's what, I guess, put them on a different trajectory. Again, there were more gender similarities than differences, with the exception that boys were more likely to say that they didn't have the grades high enough to enter into the STEM course they wanted. And finally, students were asked what would need to change in order for them to reconsider their decision. Again, we see that interest is like the critical factor here, but also the issue of competing interest pops up again. So many people said, look, I just really need a change of my interest in other areas in order for me to even consider this. Again, we see more gender similarities than differences, with the exception of boys being more likely to report that they would be motivated by financial incentives or better career opportunities, and meanwhile girls were more likely to say that they needed a change in interest towards STEM. So in many ways, I kind of feel like my PhD has kind of raised more questions than actual answers. But I think one of the things that's worth noting from this here is the issue of competing interests. And I think to some degree that's been overlooked in the quantitative literature. So quantitative scales in this area anyway often treat interest in science and math as isolated constructs, when in reality university choices are made as a trade-off between competing interests. So girls can have similar levels of interest, attitudes and achievement, but they might still choose to disengage from STEM if their level of interest is even marginally larger in other subject areas. So I think there's a real need for other studies to kind of, I don't know, use measures that kind of reflect this and reflect the real kind of life trade-off choices that people make. These are just examples of young women who talked about competing interests, but I think because I'm running out of time, we'll just go on to the next thing. The final question that we looked at in study 4 was whether young people actually talked about gender in their responses at all. So there were a number of students who did raise gender as an issue. So for instance, this young woman said that most females I know regard these subjects as being more suitable for males. They just have a male image, and for this reason, females are not particularly drawn to them. Another young woman said, I think you'd need science to be a bit more girly. It's a very man-orientated job. And finally, a young woman said, there is not much support for people in those fields like females, such as engineering. For work experience in this field, I've tried and have been knocked back. So I'm cautious, I guess, of over-interpreting these findings because in terms of frequency, they paled in comparison, I guess, to things like interest. But I think it was still worth noting, I guess, because the students weren't prompted to talk about this. So just looking at summarising what I've just talked about, differences in achievement, self-beliefs and values cannot explain 2/3 of the residual gender effect in university STEM attainment. And I guess possible reasons behind this, we talked a little bit about measurement issues, particularly with regards to the competing interest. I also think perhaps there's an issue of time, so there was a 4-year gap between the measures. But however, in saying that, we know that interests like this don't change hugely over the course of age. And finally, kind of issues of gender role incongruences that I've just talked about before. So I guess I'd be really genuinely interested to kind of hear anyone's feedback or ideas because at the moment I'm in the stage of writing my discussion and kind of completing all that. So I'd really love to hear if anyone has any particular ideas about the possible mechanisms behind that and also the other effects that we saw with the meta-analysis. But before we go, because I'm really sentimental, I just want to say thank you to my friends. So that's it. Right.
Yes, questions?
What song are you singing in that one?